one of the things that's happening right now with all the protests is it's forcing people to rethink how we do things. And of course, one of the biggest challenges is the whole issue of are we going to teach in person or teach in line, and how effective or ineffective that is. So I think we have to use this as an opportunity to rethink all the things we thought. What's the most effective ways of providing services? Is it in the schools? Is it in the hospitals? Is it in the prisons, the jails?
Yeah.
We've got to be able to rethink and then set priorities accordingly. You know, there's a lot of discussion about defunding police.
Right.
And the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, we need police. Well, let's look at what we're using police to do. And let's look at, do we need so many police in a particular neighborhood that's poverty-stricken? Can we use resources in a different way so that those communities can perhaps help themselves? And there are communities that are trying to do that despite, you know, all the outside forces. So I think it's a time for us to rethink, and it's a time for us to rethink in social work education too. You need to look at, you know, I guess one of the examples is, and there's been a lot of discussion on television about it right now, when something like this happens, whites say, well, tell me what to do, or give me some books to read. But if we had started gerontology, anyone would have gone to the library and looked for books on gerontology. So why is it so hard to deal with race in the United States? So I think white faculty, all faculty, have to begin to learn more about the history of the United States and how it impacts. I know there was a lot of discussion recently about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Black Wall Street.
Yeah.
Well, in Wilmington, North Carolina, something very similar happened, where white mobs intimidated Blacks, forced them out of town, prevented them from voting, did a coup on the elected officials. That history isn't known.
No.
So we've got to begin to look at American history in all of its entirety, and not just what we know.
Or what we think we know.
Or what we think
or what we have taken to be the truth.
Yes, yeah.
Is there a part, and thinking of social work as a practice-based profession, and as you use the example of you know, what can I read, and what can I, what's a reading list? Is there a piece of, is there a limit to the intellectualization of racism? And where does that engagement with racism on an individual level, and in dyads and small groups, where does the intellectual stop, and where does the engagement begin?
That's an interesting point, because I guess one of the issues is that Blacks and other minority groups feel what's happening. Whites intellectualize it. And how do you bring those two together so that we can work together? Or even separately, as we try to look at, you know, how we see things, and how can we look at things differently? It's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
And as some of the writers like The Fragility of White Americans has said, you know, we don't want to, it's very difficult to talk about it.
Right.
And we stay in our little areas. I think an example of this is when I used to teach racism, I think, at the University of Maryland.
Uh-huh.
And at the end of the semester, I would think that a third had been interested and had learned something. A third were exactly where they were, and a third were worse than they were more biased when they left. But one student said to me, she said, you know, I've had a Black friend, and after taking this class, for the first time, she and I talked. And she told me about her aspirations and how they had been stymied by the fact that she was Black. And this white student had never known this friend to have had those aspirations or what were some of the barriers that were unique. So I think it's that kind of communication that has to occur. And even, you know, within our respective groups, because we all have our biases.
Sure. And so it's opening that door.
Yeah.
And starting that conversation.
Yeah. And beginning to challenge all the assumptions that we have. And the other piece of it, you know, University of Michigan, their research in Black Americans. One of the articles I read there many years ago was one where immigrants said, you know, it's great to become an American citizen. You really feel like you have arrived. But for Blacks who become American citizens, you haven't arrived because you become part of that despised group in American society. And I think that really encapsulates how the color of your skin makes a difference, regardless of where you came from.
Well, you have that in terms, especially in terms of Asian immigration and the success stories that are highlighted that perpetuate the idea of a minority and that myth that's associated with it.
Yes.
And lately I've been thinking that that's also part of how it builds and breeds animosity in between populations of color. Because then there's the argument of, well, you know, if somebody is from a Latin American heritage, well, why can't you be like the Asian American student? And holding one group up, and in so doing, it creates these rifts between groups.
Yeah. And you know, I think of the Asian American Task Force in the 70s, that issue of the model minority was something that they were addressing at that point. So it's some of the same things. They might it might be dressed in different colors. And yet we know from the research that 1 or 2 generations and Asians families are having some of the same problems with their kids that all the other groups have.
Yes. And there are some groups that have perpetually struggled as well. So I guess you mentioned earlier that some of these issues that we're dealing with are systemic. And as you alluded to, there's the Black Task Force in the late 60s, the Asian Task Force. What do social workers, people who are around the MFP, people in social work education, what do all of these groups need to do to make more inroads on some of these systemic challenges?
That's the challenge. That's the challenge. And that's why I was saying earlier that social work needs to take this opportunity to look at what they're doing and how they're doing it. And as we move more into technology, how do we make sure that we aren't eliminating certain groups because of technology?
So ensuring that there's equity in terms of
Yes.
access to technology and even for schooling, if it's an elementary school to high school and a student doesn't have internet access at home, how can they be in a safe environment? And within this context, an example in terms of the COVID pandemic, how do you ensure that learning still happens within a safe environment?
And you know, the way in which our internet system is set up, there's a cost. You know, internet is not free.
Right.
So you're asking minimum wage workers to add an additional cost to their very limited expenses to provide internet access. So we've got to think much more carefully than we do now about everything that we do, because I think we tend to think from our lens and we don't think of, you know, you mentioned that your daughter will be going to school 2 days a week. Well, what's going to happen to her the other 3 days a week?
Right.
And what about those parents that have to work 5 days a week?
Right. Out of the home.
Out of the home. Because not everyone can work from home.
Right. Right.
There are people that have to be physically located. So how are we going to ensure that those people have internet access?
So in some ways, it's looking at equity, social equity in a different way as well, in terms of recognizing what, and maybe speaking more to what does privilege mean, right? Like for decades, we've been using the term underprivileged, and and it's not been terribly clear what underprivileged means, aside from maybe a Black or brown community.
And how do we privilege those Black and brown communities? And every time we you know, when you think of the 60s and Head Start and the poverty programs, and then we went to Vietnam and there was no money anymore for, you know, community development and all of those other things. And they're messy and they take time, and so the money dried up, and you know, that was it. So we know there are programs that work, and we've got to find a way to make sure that those are the programs that get funded and that they are provided and not just talked about, but you know, something is made to happen. And I think as social workers, we have to find our voices and speak out, because particularly the students who are providing clinical services, they see what the issues are for families and how difficult it is for families. And when you look at a family's interaction with the criminal justice system or the justice system, and you see how that system also prevents them from moving on. I mean, I think of the report in Ferguson where the city council was really being funded off the backs of very poor people. With things like stop, you didn't stop at a stop sign.
The tickets in the community.
And then now, of course, they have to find new sources of revenue because it's a source of revenue. But think of the damage that emphasis did to those families who could never get out of debt. They just couldn't get out of debt.
or get out of jail
or get out of jail.
if they had a bench warrant, and
Yeah.
the judicial consequences of not being able to pay a fine,
Yes.
meet
They
bail.
say in the city of Chicago, there's a large percentage of the people who are in jail are in there because they don't have $100
Right.
bail money.
Right.
So they lose their jobs, they lose their house, and they're worse off. And they haven't been found guilty yet.
Right. And it's that piece of criminalizing poverty.
Yes. Yeah. That we have to talk about and pay more attention to.
You had mentioned speaking out and going from an example like Ferguson, Missouri, and their local government. We've touched on, and as you were saying, that Carl Scott was really good at figuring out who to talk to and how to make the levers work. So when you say speak out, which aspects of speaking out are you thinking about?
I think each person has to determine for themselves, because we all have strengths and weaknesses. And because social workers work in organizations, there are consequences for speaking out.
Right.
So you really have to know the context in which you are and look at not only your where you work and you get your income, but also what resources are in the community that speak out. So it's, in a way, we're caught. We've got the information, but if we speak out in our organizations, we could be unemployed, could be fired.
Right.
On the other hand, we have the information, we need to speak out. So we have to find safe places where we can do that, whether it's through NASW or becoming involved politically or getting to know politicians, whatever it takes. And each person has to work that out for themselves.
Well, because you had also mentioned that piece of kind of from the progressive era of the 60s, and there were social programs that work, including tying Medicare benefits to poverty indicators. But yet, because of involvements in wars and military investment over the last 5+ decades, and more, decades and decades. So how, I think that there's a piece in there of a social worker can speak out and advocate for a program that they see working, that they work in, that they know is working, or that they are able to identify those outcomes. I can see a way for researchers, social work researchers, to engage in that process of using data, as you've mentioned, to be able to advocate and promote as well.
Yeah, that's our challenge. And we tend to speak out like this is, everyone is speaking out right now. But if we got another 4 years of the same administration, you lose your job if you speak out. This is not the time where you can speak out and not pay the consequences.
So it's being aware of,
yes.
And so there's a bit of using prudence.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And that's hard for, the gun-ho social worker who wants to change the world. That's a hard lesson for them, because they say, you're telling us about change, we need to go on the ramparts. Well, you have to know what the consequences are of going on the ramparts. So you have to choose your battles. We always have to choose our battles.
Sure. So you had alluded to, and I know you had started formally with CSWE in the 70s and had been, you had said that that Carl Scott had brought you and other folks in to talk to social work interns so that they could see individuals of color to guide their educational experiences. So where have we seen progress around that in the last 4 to 5 decades in your experience in the time of the MFP and the years preceding it?
I think if you look at organizations like the National Association of Black Social Workers, they have an annual conference. They bring a lot of students together. So they have done quite a bit in that area. I also think that CSWE, when they use the student volunteers at APM, that it gives them the opportunity to see at the master's level or baccalaureate level. And of course, you have the Association of Baccalaureate Educators.
Yes.
So there are lots of organizations, you know, and sometimes in our quest to have our own power, we dilute the power that we have. And I know there have been times when there have been attempts to bring together all of the organizations into one umbrella, but we seem to be better at splitting off than splitting it and coming in. So we've got all of these organizations now, when at one point it was CSWE, but then the deans got their own group, the BPD got their own group, the research people got their own group. So we've got all these groups now, and in a way we dilute our power, but I don't know how we change human nature.
So we do need to figure out a way to come together. And
that is hard. That is very, very hard.
Right. You know, especially in this time with social upheaval, a broad, nationwide, I don't even want to say reckoning, but awareness. Maybe that's where it's at, of a stage of a general awareness of the effects of, or the prevalence of systemic racism. I wonder if you could speak to how the MFP family of fellows can advance the conversations around race and ethnicity.
Well, you have a group of people that you have a captive audience. So that you can begin the conversation with this captive audience. And now we can do that by Zoom.
Right.
So you don't have to bring people together physically. You don't want to bring people together physically.
Right.
So you can bring people together electronically and have them begin to talk about it. You have to make them feel safe. Which is sometimes hard to do.
Sure.
But people have to start talking to each other. And I also think sometimes because we think of ourselves in the moment, we don't know what's going on before. And schools of social work are teaching less and less history as we try to cram everything else in. So students know less and less about the history of the profession. So we've got to maybe start where they are and help them to begin to think, not just helping their clients, but what are the systems that impact the client, and where would change make a difference? If you didn't have to come up with bail, would that make a difference to a family that gets stopped for whatever reason? You know, there's so many things we can begin to think about, and then find groups that are supporting that and work with those groups. Because it's not, I think it's Governor Cuomo that says you should never let an opportunity go to waste, but we often do. I mean, who would have thought that we were going to get some kind of gun control after Sandy Hook? Nothing happened.
Right.
So let's hope this isn't another opportunity that we're going to squander because we're afraid to ask the questions or challenge ourselves to think about how we can make a difference.
And I think that there's a piece of it that is, as you've been saying, around understanding the social context, both of the moment, but also the historical context. That it's hard to separate those two strands from an individual's current experience and situation.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I was talking to someone recently, and the person got involved with the criminal justice system, and you get one ticket and then you get another and you get another, and then of course you can't pay because it's more. And the question was, well, why didn't they go to a credit counseling service? And I said, well, you know, it's not available to everyone. And you have to know that such a thing exists.
Right.
And then you want to work with them. So a lot of things that we take for granted are not really available to people.
Right. And then it's assuming that knowledge and information gets to everyone at the same pace.
Yeah. And, you know, I would always be, and I learned over time, because social work directors change every 3 years. So you would go to a doctoral program directors meeting and you'd meet people who had never heard of the MFP because they had just become a director. So, oh, there's an MFP. So it's like you've got to repeat over and over and over and over. You can't ever take for granted that people know what the resources are. You have to always be telling about it.
That we have so much of what we've done in general is sort of ahistorical, kind of, and that's maybe a part of the social context that we're in now. But to connect to that history is so important.
You know, we've been here before.
Right.
There's a Black historian, and she talks about how every time there's some progress forward, there's backlash. So we're always constantly going forward, stepping back, going forward. So it takes longer,
right?
Because every time you move forward, there's a backlash, and then you push back, and
right.
So you keep pushing.
It's not a steady linear path.
No. I mean, look at voting rights. In this country, we all assume that, you know, everybody's eligible to vote, but there are lots of reasons why people can't vote.
Right.
And we find new ways to prevent people from voting. And now we have COVID, so do you risk your life to vote? You shouldn't have to make that choice.
Right.
You should be able to vote.